myself. My name is Gary Waterfall. Recently left the Royal Air Force after a 34-year career, retired as an Air Vice Marshal, spent my time as a Harrier pilot formerly, and then my last couple of jobs of interest were Air Officer Commanding Number 1 Group, looking after the Air Combat Group for the Royal Air Force. And then my last job before retirement and joining Clarion was the Chief of Staff at the Permanent Joint Headquarters based at Northwood, where I was responsible for the planning and execution of global operations. Now, clearly, though, it's not about me today, and a warm welcome to today's guest, Sir David Lidington. Sir David, Chair of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, which we know is the world's oldest and premier defence and security think tank. Sir David joined RUSI after over 3 decades of a stalwart career within the Conservative Party and entering the highest echelons of government and as a front bencher. So, Sir David, very warm welcome today, and thank you for joining us. I think no finer person really to answer some of the nutty questions we have before us today.
Thank you, Gary. Good to be here.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. So today, I think what we'd want to do is turn our attention to what is coming up at the results of the integrated review into defence, development, and of course, foreign policy. And it's very easy for it to be centred around just the integrated review for defence. But of course, by its very nature of being that integrated view, it's spanning a much grander scale of that. And I think particularly, not just the results, but how do they relate to us in UK and also to United Kingdom's industrial sort of heartland. I think the first question, if I can, is, in all of the open speeches I've seen from Secretary of State of Defence, from CDS, and indeed all of the single service chiefs, they mention the challenge of China ahead of the integrated review. And is there a risk here, as we look into and become fixated on that challenge, that we risk defending nowhere in our hope of actually trying to defend everywhere? So, David.
Yeah. Clearly that risk exists. And what I'm very much hoping will come out of the integrated review is a clear and very hard-headed analysis of the United Kingdom's national interests, close to home and globally, and looking forward perhaps to 25, 30 years, working out where we think the key threats to our security are going to come from, and that the recommendations from the review about the configuration of our assets, about the different capabilities that we will want to have in the next quarter of a century should flow from that analysis. I hope above all we get away from the idea that has bedeviled far too many defence reviews under different governments in the past, that you start with the model of what you're doing at the moment, and then you trim or add around the edges for particular budget headings to try to make the figures fit, rather than start with clear analysis of where the national interest lies, where the threat to our security comes from. Clearly, the strategic challenge from China is a very important part of that analysis of our national interests. And I think one of the things that the government will wish to do is to demonstrate, not least to Washington, that we can, with other allies, play a role in the Indo-Pacific region in defending overall Western as well as United Kingdom interests in the future. But clearly we also have to look to our own continent of Europe, and we need to look holistically at how both hostile states but also non-state actors are using hybrid conflict, are using a range of different instruments in order to undermine and threaten our security.
So that's great, and I'd like to return later actually to that hybrid factor that you bring in, and what I would term, acting in the grey zone, which I think pervades through much activity just today, even as we talk, for sure. I think you would probably agree with that.
Yes, very much so. Very much.
Yeah.
So. And it raises hybrid warfare. We've seen tested in most obviously Ukraine very recently, where you saw the conventional forces, the little green men in Crimea, being used, but we have seen the use of surrogates, the various sort of militias and mercenaries in the Donbass. We've seen information warfare and strategic communications deployed vigorously to support Russian interests. We have seen economic warfare, the threat of gas supplies being withheld, the access to Russian markets by, for example, Lithuanian dairy produce being interrupted. As we've seen the aggressive use of military exercises and testing of air and sea space to try to intimidate neighboring democratic countries. And we've seen the use of cultural influence, for example, through the Orthodox Church, not only in Ukraine, but in parts of the Balkans and Central Europe as well. So, we as well as diplomatic resource. So, we do need to be aware of what those challenges are. And it raises some profound questions. What is it that triggers the Article 5 NATO Security Council? Is an assault upon an ally's critical national infrastructure through bringing down its IT systems, does that constitute the attack upon one which should trigger a response from all? I mean, we need to be asking ourselves some very serious questions about this.
And indeed, I think as you talk about crossing a threshold there in terms of Article 5, it's really easy for that just inch forward in terms of that threshold, isn't it, without actually triggering into the Article 5, because what today's unprecedented action becomes tomorrow's normality. Yes, and it's a new baseline.
And let's not kid ourselves. Putin is doing this. We have seen the use of cyber attacks on countries like Estonia. We have seen probing into Swedish sea space. We have seen we've got some challenges from time to time in over our own waters and airspace. Russia just testing our vigilance. We've seen Estonian officials kidnapped from inside Estonia's borders and hauled off to Moscow and put on a show trial there. So that we shouldn't be we shouldn't be blind to the fact that our adversaries do test our resolve to see at what point the democratic West Atlantic Alliance draws the line. And I do think that our planners need to make sure they've thought through those contingencies, and they have in plan various tripwires and have a good idea of what their responses should be, and quickly, in a variety of circumstances.
Yeah, so I totally agree. And also, turning, you just mentioned Russian Putin there, the use of these proxy forces or the mercenary forces, such as the Wagner Group, which we've seen in Syria and also most recently in Libya, as an extension of their sort of conventional armed forces, which are allowing them a degree of distance from that military calculus, that were it to go wrong or were it to get played out into the international media in not a positive sense, they have an element of distance from that action, at least at the top level.
Yes, no, that is certainly the case. And I don't know the extent to which it's true. I've seen reports recently of how that Syrian fighters are being deployed in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Now, I haven't sort of got sufficient detail about that to be confident about the judgment. I've seen the reports, but if people look at what's happened in Libya or in Ukraine, and other powers look at that, they will draw conclusions, or perhaps this technique could work for us as well.
So I totally agree, and I think this sort of segues nicely to me into question 2. When we look at the UK now, and indeed into UK industry, how do we gear ourselves up to face several of these near-peer threats and adversaries, really, and competitors that we've discussed? It might be Russia, it might be China, or other sort of adversaries around the world. Yet at the same time, and we've done very well in getting so far through the discussion in not mentioning the clear and present danger faced by the pandemic, and that is COVID. So at the same time as we're facing up to these near-peer competitors, how do we get sufficient resilience to cope with all of these immediate challenges that are born from COVID, and not only the pandemic itself, but clearly, and we've seen the budget get delayed already, from the significant budget challenges that are going to exist?
Yes, and actually one of the worries I still have is that the uncertainty over the budget and spending review means that we don't get the sort of strategic vision and decision making on the integrated review. And I hope my fears are misplaced on that. And I have a huge regard for John Bew, who's heading up the integrated review work in number 10. I'm sure the Prime Minister will want to deliver something that really does last here, but there's obviously a challenge if you haven't got your budget and public spending sorted out for a few years at least. Let's look at your question. Let me take the other threats and contingency planning, resilience first. I certainly came to the view after my time in the Cabinet Office, where I had responsibility for the Civil Contingencies Unit, and sort of even ahead of COVID, that the government needed to overhaul its approach to contingency planning. I mean, the civil servants that we've got doing that job, I think, are good. But I actually agree with those who say that you need a stronger and more coherent centre of government to drive cross-departmental priorities generally in Whitehall, and I would put contingency planning in that category. It is extraordinarily difficult to get ministers at any level, let alone cabinet, to free up time at the same moment in any given week to sit around a table to discuss something hypothetical, which you hope never happens, and actually is more probably it will not happen than that it will happen. But if it does happen, it can be pretty catastrophic. So I would like to see a more regular sort of refreshment of not just official but ministerial minds about what you would do in various contingencies. And I think the pandemic experience has sort of, I think, probably caused Whitehall to reflect and sort of accept the need to raise its game on this in the future. Going to defend what you just said about industry. I think, again, I go back to the need for the hard-headed clarity about where the United Kingdom's national interests lie. And if, as I think is going to be the case with the review, we conclude that, for example, we will need to do more in terms of cyber and space, and that technologically we will need to embrace AI and robotics and drones to a much greater extent than we've done previously. And the senior military people that I've talked to about this all get this completely, and actually are quite powerful advocates of Nick Carter down and say, look, this is the way the world is going. And fascinating, when I represented Theresa May at the Armed Forces Day at Salisbury last year, the talking to the military at their stands afterwards, they were all full of the opportunities for more effective military responses they thought would come from these new technologies. That then means, you look at industry, we do have to make sure that we have a pipeline of skills in those new technologies. And so, for example, on cyber, it's well known that we don't have enough people yet who are skilled in cyber, both either for defensive or offensive purposes. We need to get better through our industrial strategy at linking the cutting edge research in universities with practical applications of new science and technology in both the manufacturing industry, but in defense industries in particular. And then we need to have in our law and regulatory practice on takeovers, acquisitions, mergers, an eye to the bottom line of our security interests. So I think it is right for the government to be looking at, and I read that they're intending to introduce measures to exercise greater government supervision over a foreign takeover of, for example, a British AI enterprise or a British robotics enterprise. I think personally that is the right way to go. I don't think we can ever have a completely autarkic arrangement, where we somehow sort of cut ourselves off from the world. I mean, the UK, we're still a significant military power, but we're going to be too small provide a market on our own for
Yeah.
this. But the model I have in the back of my mind is a bit like the COCOM regulations that we had during the Cold War, where we had a series of checks and restrictions on products and technologies that could be sold to countries linked to Russia and the Warsaw Pact, Soviet Union in those days. And I think we need to reinvent a way of thinking a bit like that to ensure that our security is better protected now.
Yeah, so can I just come back at the start? You mentioned about the IR and the fact the budget has been postponed into the new year. There is obviously a risk here that the IR isn't as expansive as we hoped it would be. Doesn't provide that strategic, I suppose, that the strategic financial bedrock with which to step forward, and that then couples with, clearly trying to have that hypothetical discussion today about what may happen in the future as opposed to what is happening, and the clear threat we're facing from the pandemic makes it more difficult. But of course, on the other side of that coin, for UK industry, particularly if we look at electronic warfare threats, you can't just pull those out of the bottom drawer and bolt them onto a ship or an aeroplane, onto a tank. That takes years of development and keeping pace with the adversaries in the near peer environment. So would you agree that there is a risk as we step into the results of this Red Review, because of the clear and present danger we're facing, we end up in the unfortunate position that we just don't get that strategic direction that I think we need, that would therefore help UK industry?
Oh, the risk is clearly there, but the very fact, Gary, that you have identified it, and other commentators have identified that risk, I think ought to keep the government alert to that challenge. And I mean, it is going to be a test of their strategic vision, but this is being driven from number 10, and I'm pretty confident that the Prime Minister wants to be remembered, amongst other things, for having put our security arrangements on a new basis, with founded on a strategic grasp of where the threats and risks are going to come from in the future. And he certainly got in John Bew and others, sort of team around him, who are urging such an approach. So I'm aware. I think we are aware of the risk, yes. And I think that there'll be some difficult fiscal decisions to be taken. And I'm in the camp of those who think that, certainly out of COVID, it is inevitable that the aggregate tax burden is going to have to rise in the years to come. How that's done is going to be difficult set decisions for whoever's in government, this government or any future government in the years to come. But that, I think, is just inevitable to make the books balance and to avoid that getting completely out of control. But I think that the public in Britain does still get the importance of defence and security, and they get the fact that no country these days is a real island, that international terror, organised crime, the influence of hostile states, uses technologies like the internet, uses the advantage of robotics and miniaturization to seek advantage. And that means that we both have to work with allies and that we have to put our security as the top priority when it comes to the allocation of expenditure and scarce resources. And I think that argument can be won. And I think it's important, if global Britain is to be turned from a slogan into a policy that has meaning and weight. There's big opportunities next year with government leading the G7 and with the Global Climate Conference in Glasgow. And I think if the IR is successful, then that becomes a third very visible pillar, demonstrating that outside the European Union, the UK is going to continue to play a dynamic and influential role in world affairs.
So, David, I totally agree. And I definitely see sort of this post-pandemic in the global Britain, in the post-Brexit era as well, a real opportunity here for UK to stand loud and proud about the industrial capabilities, about the aerospace, the overall defence industry, and drive prosperity, particularly given from a UK perspective, not only just that defence capabilities, but turning that into the environmental challenges that we all face as well, and knowing there are quite a few companies out there that are leading the field on not only providing better capability for defence, but also addressing some of those environmental challenges.
Absolutely, that is right, and you know, while the focus of our conversation today, focus of Rusi's work is defence and security matters. I mean, one of the things we really picked up on at Rusi is not just that we're talking not just about the three conventional services, but space, cyber as well, but also now that, you know, there isn't a neat dividing line between domestic security and global security matters, and we're devoting more resource at Rusi than we did in the past to looking some of those domestic security challenges and how they are influenced by international developments. You talk to any chief constable, and they will tell you that there is almost no serious organized crime in the United Kingdom that lacks an international dimension of some kind or other. So we have to have a holistic view of all of this. I mean, the other point that I would stress is that as we go forward, it will be important to work with allies as well. The US is going to need convincing, whether it's Donald Trump, and if it is Joe Biden, it's going to need convincing that it is still in their national interests to maintain a resolute commitment to the security of Europe. But they will want the European powers, you know, Britain, France to the fore, to take on not just a greater share of the security burden, but to take on a greater share of the political leadership, especially, for example, in Africa, where I think the US will not see its own duty to play a leading role there. I think they'll be saying to the Europeans, you know, you could be doing more to support the West in the Indo-Pacific, maintain trade routes and freedom of navigation and so on. And I can see the case, for example, with our carrier groups for to have one of those stationed in the Indo-Pacific. But I suspect you could only make that sustainable if you were working with the Australians, with the Japanese, perhaps with the South Koreans, the French there. So it was an allied naval contingent. Of course, the treaty that we negotiated with France, that David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy signed back in 2010 or 2011, I think that
2010,
was.
I think. Yeah, 2010.
Yeah. That provides quite a nice model, because it talked about working on the basis that you would train and tailor the configuration of your forces so that they could slot into, both UK and French contingents could slot into an allied expeditionary force sent to serve humanitarian or counter-terrorist objectives, and I think with Africa again particularly in mind. And I think we have to be in that habit of thinking about not just what could we do on our own, but how in our training, in ensuring interoperability of our equipment, that we can work seamlessly with allies in a range of different configurations and alliances, depending on the nature of the threat we're facing.
So I think you're right, and that's such a rub, isn't it, between having a sovereign capability or being international by design, and managing to weave that together. And you mentioned the Cameron-Sarkozy agreement, and indeed it's good. Even today, we have UK CH-47 Chinooks in Mali, helping with the French. And that, we are definitely walking the walk, talking the talk here. And I think, post that agreement, of course, the very next stage in 2011 was the Libyan conflict, where, even under that US administration, they very much took an enabling and relative back seat and allowed Europe, under the guise of NATO, clearly a NATO-led operation, but Europe to do far more of the heavy lifting, and to use the phrase, because it's in our backyard, not theirs. And I think we're going to see that increasingly over time. I'm sure you'd agree with that.
I think I'm absolutely right. And I remember the Libya conflict started. I mean, it's very clear President Obama was blunt that he would provide material support, but he wanted Britain and France to take on the leadership role here. This was not a matter where the United States was going to exercise the lead and take responsibility. And I think we will see more of that. I think Sahel is a very good example. I think Somalia is another. And NATO, NATO clearly was able to define its mission as including a degree of intervention in Libya. I think one of the things that we're going to have to sort out as well in the post-Brexit world is what our relationship is going to be with the EU's common foreign security and common security defence policies, because although the External Action Service is not the beefy global actor that its inventors hoped it should be, so there's maybe some good reasons for that, but actually what the EU has at its disposal is, of course, the ability to act in theatres outside the NATO remit, but also to bring in things like development assistance, police training missions, and the like, that are not available to NATO, which is very much still a military alliance. And so I don't see, a constructive and strategic relationship with the EU as being in contradiction to global Britain. I see it as a part of global Britain, as one important alliance and relationship, sitting there as a part of a network of others.
Yeah, indeed. I've spent a little bit of time in Somalia myself in my last job in the military in the Chief of Staff role, and there watching the UK forces working within the EU training mission, or actually separate to, yet very complementary. And certainly that's a relationship that's going to continue. And I'm really proud of what we're doing actually in Somalia, going to that grassroots, going across a comprehensive approach against the defence and the security. It's not just about the SNA, the National Army. It's about getting the police, the law and order correct to start building that company up. And I guess I'd like to see, say that we can see green shoots already appearing there.
Yes, I think absolutely. I think there's a real, there's a long way to go in Somalia, but I think there have been some real advances there. And I think you mentioned the military training mission. I mean, the other one, of course, was Atalanta, where Northwood hosted the headquarters for that. And where again, I mean, I'm an unashamed, strong supporter of NATO and its continued importance and relevance. But what I saw in Atlanta was that you were able to bring in neutral European countries that, for various political and historic reasons, didn't feel able to belong to NATO, but they were able to play a part, make a contribution to what was definitely a Western sort of military operation.
Yeah,
so do that with an EU hat, you couldn't do it with the non-NATO members for those other European countries. And
they're all clubs in the bag, aren't they? And it's making sure you're using the right club at the right time. So can I say? Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, if you're sitting in Washington, I think when the Americans look at the European powers, and particularly Britain and France, they're not going to be too bothered about which system, which organization takes the lead. Just be saying, look, you lot get your act together. You need to be doing more.
Brilliant. Hey, so can I segue into the last question if I can? And I promised that I'd return to hybrid activity, or for me, it's what I term the grey zone. And as I said, even as we sit here chatting today, then I think, there are elements of grey zone activity almost certainly going on, either in this country or certainly in a wider European or into the Middle East. From a UK perspective, when we look at the political and the industrial leadership, how do they kind of work together to help cultivate, I think, and encourage the UK society to sit up and sort of take notice that if we want to get our defence right, if we want to get deterrence right, then we probably should be hardening ourselves against this threat that we pose and that is real on a daily basis. I guess my addition here would be some of this sits within compartments, within little boxes and areas that don't really necessarily get into the public domain, perhaps as often as they could. But when they don't, and the talk's the little green men, it then gives people a kind of a fanciful notion that it's all right, isn't it? This is just playing out in some fictitious film the reality is, you and I both know, it's here and it's happening today. So how do we help turn that tide?
Yes, and the challenge is that for a huge number of families in this country, there will be the sense that these conflicts are happening in far away places about which we know and care relatively little, and it doesn't touch my family directly. Now, the way I think you deal with this is threefold. You certainly need clarity, which again has to flow from a clear, agreed analysis of the threat. If you don't get that right, nothing else is going to come right, because skillful messaging on its own, if you've not got a coherent message to sell, is pointless. But you need the clarity of the message, and I think one important element in that is this intrinsic link between domestic security threat and global security. Salisbury actually was a very clear demonstration of that. I really think cut through in a big way to people. Part of that means that you deploy all the most effective spokesmen you can. They're not necessarily politicians. Politicians will play their part. Industry chiefs can up to a point, but not every industry chief is a brilliant communicator. The intelligence chiefs, I think, are really important assets here. And I think the fact that they now do make speeches, they are known publicly, they write articles, is a big advantage that we have compared with when they were entirely in the shadows. So the media sit up and take notice when C or the director of the security service or GCHQ to make a speech. Third, find a way to try to make these important and to some extent inevitably secret stories about the threats to us public and easily comprehensible. Now, one example I'd sort of suggest is how the National Cybersecurity Centre operates. I mean, the NCSC, as you know, it's set up as an offshoot of GCHQ, but deliberately designed to be public facing and putting stuff on its website and in its materials that is meant to be publicly accessible, particularly to business, to advise them on better cybersecurity. And they will tell you that there's a long way to go in getting sufficient awareness of this, but they've made, I think, a huge amount of progress since they were established 4 years ago. And I think that's quite a good lesson to learn from about how you communicate and make it, because it's making the threat relevant in NCSC's case to the operations and the financial viability of businesses. So you have to translate your analysis of the threat into something that means something in people's family or household or business circumstances. And then finally, I think for business in particular, make it relevant by talking about apprenticeships and sponsoring them, talking about skills, building up the relationship with universities, demonstrating that, as you said earlier, with respect to climate, that these skills and technologies can be applied to meet some civil threats to our way of life, as well as military or criminal threats to our way of life from elsewhere in the world. So that it's business is seen as helping to provide the answers, but also at the same time providing careers and opportunities for people in their lives. Because again, if we don't get the skilled workforce and the pipeline of those skills in place, then we can be hollering all we like, but we're not going to have adequate security arrangements.
Yeah, so in fact, it links back to one of the answers you gave earlier, and that's about getting the colleges, getting the universities, getting the schools. And we've done an awful lot in this country, maybe too late, in terms of STEM. We know how precious short we are of scientists, of engineers, and we're doing a lot about that now to encourage the youth of today to become the engineer and the scientist of tomorrow. But we now need to start turning our attention, we're overdue turning our attention indeed to cyber. So how far back do you take that down the link from the universities into the colleges and into the schools? And is the way that we should be, not of course messing with the curriculum, but in terms of making those opportunities wider and more accessible at an earlier stage? I guess from cyber, because it's relatively interesting, because of the generation that exists today that demands social media and spend a lot of time online chatting like this, it's a more of a natural bedfellow for them. But is there more that could be done, do you feel?
Oh, what could be done? I think actually the intelligence agencies are ahead of most of the rest of the field on this in actually trying to get the message through to gaming addicts that actually
Yes,
your way of thinking is exactly what we need for some of our work. But I think that and actually, just in passing, it's a very interesting crossover. The UK, as you know, is one of the global centres and growth areas for computer gaming. You go to someone like Dundee, and this is a sort of boom sector. And of course, these are also the technologies that the military and intelligence services are using more and more, both for simulations and for intelligence gathering for actual sort of conflict. I think you need to go right down to school level, because you need to be asking yourself questions as to why do so few people opt for, say, physics as an A-level subject. Why do so few secondary schools actually teach the three sciences as separate disciplines? And I'm afraid there's some really tricky questions there about salaries, because somebody who has a good mathematics or physics degree is going to be paid far more if they go into the city and the financial services sector than if they go into an engineering or defence company, let alone if they go in front of a class in a school. So I think there's some pretty big questions about rewards there that have got to be sorted out. So and perhaps you need something like Teach First with a bit even more cutting edge to try to get more graduates, at least do some time there. Perhaps you say to business, could they release students for a sabbatical year or a term or something to help out in schools? That it won't work for everybody. You've got to have a certain gift for teaching. You're the most technologist in the world, and you may be hopeless in front of a class of 15-year-olds. But I think you have to do that. But also, you should be saying at the same time, people who are choosing to study arts, social science subjects to an advanced level, that there is a route in for you as well, because you will need your engineers and your mathematicians, but also you will need people who are have arts background but are capable of lateral thinking and have the analytical skills that you want as well. So I think STEM is important, but I think it's important we don't think of that exclusively. It is much more, I think, about trying to make the careers and the opportunities in these sectors of business more attractive to bright young men and women from all backgrounds.
So David, that's been fascinating. As a last point from me, and I smiled when you talked about Teach First and teaching. I'm a very proud father of a 26-year-old daughter who's been through Teach First, and she's now an A-level chemistry teacher and science teacher at a school about half an hour from here. And I can absolutely echo your thoughts about the remuneration side of it, because the bank of dad is most certainly not closed at this stage. Hey, so David, thank you so much for your candid views and your extensive insight across what's been for me, a fascinating discussion. I think there are definitely challenges ahead. The integrated review, we hope, will probably roll out towards the end of next month, certainly pre-Christmas. And with good fortune, I think it is going to provide that strategic landscape and bringing government together in this integrated way. I've talked and been taught previously about the comprehensive approach. We have the fusion doctrine, where we're really trying to bring everything together so that all of us together are far greater than those individual parts. And hopefully this is what the integrated review is going to be. You then align that with Global Britain, with the prosperity agenda. And I think there's some very interesting times and opportunities ahead for UK industry.
Thank you very much indeed, Gary. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks, David. Thanks very much.
Thanks.